Very blessed with my film career. It all began with Bruce Lee.
At 85 years old, Chuck Norris sits in his Texas ranch, the morning light filtering through windows that overlook acres of land he's walked 1,000 times. His voice, gravelly with age but still commanding, breaks a silence he's maintained for decades. I don't think my films are in the same range as Bruce's. It's a rare confession, spoken not with bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that only comes from living long enough to see your own mythology written, rewritten, and transformed into internet memes that bear little resemblance to the truth. For over 50 years, the world has asked the same question: what was Bruce Lee really like? And more provocatively, who would have won in a real fight between Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee? These questions have haunted martial arts fans, spawned countless debates, and created a mythology so powerful that it often obscures the human beings at its center. Two legends who defined martial arts cinema, bound together by rivalry, respect, and a friendship that neither Hollywood nor history fully understood. The contrast is stark and haunting. Chuck Norris, the stoic warrior, has lived to see technology change, to watch his grandchildren grow, to witness martial arts evolve from underground discipline to mainstream phenomenon. Bruce Lee, frozen forever at 32, remains perpetually young in our collective consciousness, his energy immortal, his legend untouchable by time. One man aged into wisdom, the other became timeless through tragedy. But what few people know is the depth of their connection. The secret training sessions in Chuck's backyard in Los Angeles, where two of the world's greatest martial artists would spend hours testing techniques, exchanging philosophies, and pushing each other beyond what they thought possible. The laughter between takes on a Roman film set. The mutual respect that ran deeper than any choreographed fight scene could ever capture. The moment in 1972 that changed both their lives and altered the trajectory of martial arts history forever. At 85, Chuck Norris isn't interested in perpetuating myths or feeding the machine of his own legend. The Chuck Norris facts, the action hero persona, the countless films where he played the indestructible American warrior, all of that feels distant now, like a costume he wore for a particular season of his life. What interests him now is truth. The real story of two men who came from different worlds, spoke different languages, but understood each other in the only language that truly mattered, the language of dedication, discipline, and the relentless pursuit of mastery. This is that story. Carlos Ray Norris was born in Ryan, Oklahoma in 1940, the son of an alcoholic father and a mother who held the family together through sheer force of will. He was a shy boy, painfully quiet, the kind of child who would shrink into corners at social gatherings, embarrassed by his father's drinking, uncertain of his place in a world that seemed too loud, too harsh, too overwhelming. Nothing about young Carlos suggested he would one day become synonymous with toughness, strength, and unshakable confidence. The transformation began not with a dramatic moment of decision, but with circumstance. In 1958, at 18 years old, Norris joined the United States Air Force. He was sent to Osan Air Base in South Korea, where he served as an air policeman. It was there, in a country still healing from war, that he encountered Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial art that emphasized striking techniques, forms, and mental discipline. Something dormant awakened inside him. For the first time in his life, the shy boy from Oklahoma found something he could pour himself into completely. Training became his refuge, his meditation, his purpose. The movements were challenging, the discipline demanding, but for someone who had spent his childhood feeling powerless, martial arts offered something revolutionary: control. Control over his body, his mind, his destiny. He wasn't naturally gifted. He didn't possess Bruce Lee's explosive speed or innate fluidity. What he had was something perhaps more valuable: an obsessive commitment to improvement, hour after hour, year after year, even when progress felt impossibly slow. When he returned to the United States, Norris opened his first karate school in Torrance, California. He began competing in tournaments, and the early years were humbling. He lost to Joe Louis, one of the most formidable fighters of the era. He lost to Alan Steen. Each defeat could have been a reason to quit, but instead, each became fuel. He studied his losses obsessively, analyzed what went wrong, and returned to training with renewed intensity. His philosophy was simple. If someone could beat him, it meant he had something to learn. By the late 1960s, Chuck Norris had become one of the most respected names in American karate. He won tournament after tournament, eventually becoming a 6-time professional middleweight karate champion. His style was characterized by power, precision, and an almost mechanical efficiency. Where others relied on flashiness, Chuck relied on fundamentals executed at the highest level. Where others sought the knockout blow, Chuck built his victories through systematic dismantling of his opponent's defenses. He was at the height of his competitive career, respected by peers, feared by opponents, and operating several successful martial arts schools across Southern California. He had transformed himself from that shy boy in Oklahoma into Chuck, a man who could command any room with a stare, whose reputation preceded him into every tournament, every training hall, every conversation about who was truly the best. But one meeting in 1968 would forever shift the trajectory of his life and his destiny. The year was 1968. The location was a karate tournament, one of dozens that took place across California each year, where martial artists from different styles and schools would gather to test their skills. Chuck Norris was there in his capacity as one of the premier competitors, a man at the absolute peak of his powers. And then he met Bruce Lee. Bruce was unlike anyone Chuck had encountered in the martial arts world. He was fast, almost incomprehensibly so, his movements possessing a quality that seemed to defy normal human limitations. But it wasn't just the physical speed that impressed Chuck. It was the confidence, the magnetic charisma, the way Bruce could hold court in any conversation, discussing philosophy, film, training methodology, and the nature of combat with equal fluency and insight. Their connection was instant, built on mutual respect, wrapped in competitive curiosity. Here were two men who had dedicated their lives to martial arts, but who approached the discipline from fundamentally different angles. Bruce Lee was in the process of developing Jeet Kune Do, his philosophical approach to martial arts that rejected rigid forms and styles in favor of adaptability, directness, and personal expression. "Be like water," he would say, advocating for a fluidity that could adapt to any situation, any opponent, any challenge. Chuck, by contrast, represented the disciplined traditionalist. His karate was structured, methodical, built on repetition and the perfection of fundamental techniques. Where Bruce saw martial arts as self-expression, Chuck saw it as self-mastery. Where Bruce sought to break free from forms, Chuck found freedom within them. The contrast could have created conflict, but instead it created fascination. They began training together, meeting at Chuck's house in the San Fernando Valley. These weren't casual sessions, but intensive explorations of technique, philosophy, and capability. Bruce would demonstrate his 1-inch punch, the devastating power generated from seemingly no distance at all. Chuck would share insights from his tournament experience, the strategies that worked against different styles of opponents. They sparred, not to defeat each other but to learn, to test, to expand their understanding of what martial arts could be. Bruce's wife, Linda, would later recall these afternoons, the sound of bodies moving and striking, the intense discussions that would follow training, the mutual admiration between two men who recognized something rare in each other, absolute commitment to excellence. They weren't just training partners, they were becoming friends, bound by a shared obsession that few people could truly understand. In 1971, Bruce left for Hong Kong. His attempts to break into Hollywood had been frustrated by racism and typecasting. American producers couldn't see past his Chinese heritage to recognize his talent and star power. Hong Kong offered an opportunity, and Bruce seized it, starring in films that would transform him from a martial arts instructor to an international phenomenon. But before he left, he made Chuck a promise. "One day I'm going to call you to be in a film with me." That call came in 1972, and it would change martial arts cinema forever. To understand the significance of what Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris created together, we must understand who Bruce was and what he represented. Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco in 1940, the same year as Chuck, but his early life followed a dramatically different trajectory. His father, Lee Hoi Chuen, was a Cantonese opera star, and the family moved to Hong Kong when Bruce was just a few months old. He grew up in Kowloon, a chaotic, crowded neighborhood where street fights were common and toughness was currency. Bruce became involved in gangs as a teenager, using his growing martial arts skills in real street confrontations. His parents, worried about his path, sent him back to America at 18. He arrived in San Francisco with $100 and a determination to build something extraordinary. He enrolled at the University of Washington, studying philosophy while teaching martial arts to support himself. It was there he met Linda Emery, who would become his wife and the keeper of his legacy. What made Bruce revolutionary wasn't just his physical ability, but his intellectual approach to martial arts. He studied everything: Wing Chun from the legendary Ip Man, Western boxing, fencing, philosophy from sources as diverse as Krishnamurti and Alan Watts. He rejected the traditional Chinese martial arts system that kept techniques secret and teaching rigid. He believed martial arts should be scientific, constantly evolving, stripped of unnecessary movements and cultural traditions that served ego rather than effectiveness. This led to the creation of Jeet Kune Do, which wasn't a style but an anti-style, a philosophy that encouraged practitioners to absorb what was useful, reject what was useless, and add what was uniquely their own. Using no way as way, having no limitation as limitation, Bruce would explain, it was martial arts as jazz, as personal expression, as continuous adaptation. But his true genius might have been his ability to translate this philosophy to film. When Hollywood proved resistant, Bruce returned to Hong Kong and created films that were unlike anything Asian cinema had produced before. The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, and The Way of the Dragon weren't just action movies. They were statements about Chinese identity, post-colonial anger, and the power of the individual against systems of oppression. Bruce wasn't just fighting on screen. He was fighting the system itself, channeling the frustrations of a generation into movements of devastating grace and power. He became more than a movie star. He became a symbol, an icon of Asian pride and martial arts mastery. And he was only just beginning. At 32 years old, Bruce Lee was on the verge of global superstardom, with Enter the Dragon poised to introduce him to Western audiences on an unprecedented scale. Everything he had worked for was within reach. Rome, 1972. The Coliseum stands as it has for nearly 2,000 years, a monument to combat, to spectacle, to the human appetite for witnessing warriors test themselves against one another. And into this ancient arena, Bruce Lee brought his vision for what would become the most iconic fight scene in martial arts cinema history. Bruce was writer, director, and star of The Way of the Dragon, a film that would showcase not just his fighting ability, but his understanding of cinema, choreography, and storytelling through movement. For the film's climactic fight, he wanted someone specific: Chuck Norris. He wanted a real martial artist, someone whose credibility was undeniable, whose presence would lend authenticity to every frame. When Bruce called, Chuck didn't hesitate. The Coliseum fight between Tang Lung and Colt has been analyzed frame by martial arts enthusiasts for over 50 years. What makes it transcendent isn't just the technical proficiency, though that's certainly present. It's the narrative embedded in the choreography. Bruce arrives wearing his iconic yellow tracksuit, later stripping down to showcase his legendary physique. Chuck enters as Colt, the American martial artist, confident and powerful, representing Western discipline and strength. The fight begins slowly, almost ceremonially, with both fighters testing, measuring, seeking to understand their opponent. This wasn't typical for martial arts films of the era, which often prioritized constant action. But Bruce understood that real fights, especially between skilled opponents, include calculation, strategy, the chess match before the explosion. What audiences see in those 7 minutes is genuine martial arts mastery. The strikes are real, pulled just enough to prevent injury, but delivered with authentic power and intent. The breathing, the footwork, the subtle adjustments in stance and positioning. These are details that separate actual martial artists from actors pretending. Both men are truly fighting, within the controlled context of choreography, but fighting nonetheless. Chuck later recalled the intensity of filming, particularly one moment that became legendary among those who were there. During one take, Bruce grabbed Chuck's chest hair and ripped it out. The pain was real, immediate, and visible on Chuck's face. But after Bruce called cut, both men burst into laughter. It was the kind of moment that only happens between friends, when pain becomes comedy, because trust runs deeper than discomfort. The filming conditions were challenging. They were shooting illegally in the Coliseum, without proper permits, racing against time and the possibility of being shut down. The summer heat was oppressive, and both fighters were pushing their bodies to the limit, take after take, angle after angle, until Bruce was satisfied that they had captured something special. The fight's conclusion is both brutal and philosophical. Tang Lung defeats Colt but shows mercy, covering his body with his GI as a gesture of respect. This wasn't just Bruce showing respect to Chuck the actor. It was Tang Lung showing respect to Colt the warrior, acknowledging that defeat doesn't diminish honor. The scene ends with Tang Lung walking away from the Coliseum, perhaps symbolizing Bruce's own complex relationship with combat, cinema, and the violence that had defined so much of his journey. What Bruce and Chuck created wasn't just a scene, it was a statement, a dialogue between equals, between East and West, between different philosophies of martial arts and different approaches to mastery. It was two of the greatest martial artists of their generation, at the peak of their powers, creating something that would outlive them both. The question is inevitable, asked by every martial arts fan who has seen their Coliseum battle. Who would have won in a real fight between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris? It's a question both men faced countless times during Bruce's life, and that Chuck has continued to face for the 50 years since Bruce's death. The answer, like all questions about hypothetical combat between masters, is complex, unsatisfying, and ultimately beside the point. Consider their respective styles and strengths. Bruce Lee was speed incarnate, possessing reflexes and quickness that seemed almost superhuman. His one-inch punch could generate devastating power from nearly no distance. His training regimen was obsessive and varied, incorporating weight training, cardiovascular conditioning, flexibility work, and constant study of different martial arts disciplines. He was trained in Wing Chun, had absorbed Western boxing techniques, studied fencing footwork, and was constantly evolving his approach based on what proved effective. Chuck Norris, by contrast, was grounded power and methodical precision. He had real competitive experience, having faced dozens of opponents in actual tournament competition where the outcomes mattered and the pressure was genuine. His Tang Soo Do, later augmented with other styles to form his own system called Chun Kuk Do, emphasized powerful kicks, solid stances, and the systematic breakdown of opponents' defenses. Where Bruce was water, Chuck was stone, immovable, dependable, crushing. Their sparring sessions, which happened regularly during their friendship, were real but respectful. Both men understood that true friendship between martial artists requires both testing each other and knowing when not to push too far. Linda Lee has confirmed that Bruce and Chuck sparred frequently, and that Bruce had tremendous respect for Chuck's abilities, particularly his kicking power and tournament experience. The physical differences are worth noting. Bruce Lee stood 5 feet 7 inches and typically weighed around 135 pounds. His physique was legendary. Shredded musculature with body fat percentages that would make modern bodybuilders envious. But he was not a large man. Chuck stood 6 feet tall and competed at around 175 pounds, giving him significant advantages in reach, weight, and power. In combat sports, these physical disparities matter immensely. But Bruce's advantage was his scientific approach and adaptability. He didn't just train, he studied, analyzed, experimented. He understood leverage, timing, and the biomechanics of striking in ways that were ahead of his time. If Bruce were alive today, He would likely be fascinated by mixed martial arts and would be studying every aspect of modern combat sports to absorb useful techniques. Chuck has consistently shown remarkable humility when discussing this question. In interviews spanning decades, he has praised Bruce's speed, intelligence, and innovative approach. Bruce was the best martial artist of his generation, Chuck has said multiple times. He's also noted that in their sparring sessions, Bruce's speed was remarkable and his ability to adapt mid-exchange was impressive. But Chuck also knows what few people acknowledge. Tournament competition and real fighting teach lessons that no amount of private training can replicate. Perhaps the truth was never about who would win. Perhaps it was about how much they made each other better. Bruce pushed Chuck to think beyond rigid forms, to explore fluidity and adaptation. Chuck showed Bruce the value of tested techniques, the lessons learned only through competitive pressure. Their friendship, their training sessions, their collaboration, all of it served to elevate both men beyond what they might have been alone. Over the decades since Bruce Lee's death in 1973, Chuck Norris has been asked about his friend thousands of times. Journalists, fans, documentary filmmakers, martial arts historians, everyone wants to know what Bruce was really like, wants Chuck to provide some previously unknown insight, some secret that will help them understand the legend. Chuck's responses have been remarkably consistent, marked by genuine respect and a refusal to participate in the mythology that often distorts Bruce's memory. "I enjoyed working with Bruce Lee in the film," Chuck said in one interview, his tone matter-of-fact. "It was a lot of fun, and it's nice to be involved in a fight scene that everyone loves." There's no grandiosity in these words, no attempt to inflate his own importance or diminish Bruce's achievement. What Chuck has consistently rejected is the notion that he and Bruce were rivals in any meaningful sense. "We were friends," he said repeatedly. "We trained together, learned from each other, and had tremendous respect for each other's abilities. The idea that there was some bitter rivalry is complete fiction. The media narrative wanted conflict, wanted a clear hero and villain, wanted the story to fit familiar patterns. But the truth was more nuanced and more human." Chuck describes Bruce as intense but playful, demanding but generous with his knowledge, supremely confident but never arrogant about his abilities. On the set of The Way of the Dragon, Bruce was simultaneously director, star, and choreographer, a level of control that could easily lead to tyrannical behavior. But Chuck recalls him as collaborative, open to suggestions, focused on creating the best possible scene rather than protecting his ego. There's also a weight that Chuck carries, one he rarely discusses, but that's evident in his careful words. The weight of being the man Bruce Lee beat. In the mythology of martial arts cinema, that role defines much of how Chuck is remembered. He played the final boss, the ultimate opponent, the man whose defeat solidified Bruce's supremacy. It's an honor and a burden simultaneously. At 85, Chuck's reflections have taken on a different quality. There's less concern about reputation, less need to prove anything, more willingness to sit with difficult truths. In recent interviews, he's spoken about how Bruce's passing still feels like losing a brother. It's not hyperbole or sentimentality. These were two men who shared something precious and rare, a mutual understanding of what it means to dedicate your life completely to mastery, to struggle against your own limitations, to transform yourself through discipline and will. Bruce would have been the greatest martial artist of all time if he had lived, Chuck has said. There's no jealousy in this statement, no qualification or hedge, just the straightforward assessment of one master recognizing another's potential cut short by tragedy. Behind the tough exterior and martial arts mastery was a man struggling with the same challenges that face everyone: how to balance ambition with family, how to maintain relationships while pursuing excellence, how to be a good father and husband while traveling constantly for competitions, and later, film roles. Chuck's first marriage to Diane Holchek in 1958 produced two sons, Mike and Eric. The marriage lasted 3 decades, but was marked by the tensions inherent in Chuck's rising career. Tournament competitions, teaching obligations, and eventually film roles meant extended absences. Chuck has been honest about his failings during this period, acknowledging that his pursuit of martial arts excellence sometimes came at the expense of his family relationships. The discipline that made him a champion fighter didn't automatically translate to being a champion husband or father. It's a lesson he learned slowly, painfully, through mistakes and missed moments. His son Eric tragically died in 2001, and Chuck has spoken about the profound regret of not being more present during his children's formative years, of prioritizing career over connection. After his divorce from Diane, Chuck married Gina O'Kelly in 1998 when he was 58 years old. Gina became his partner in a different kind of way, not just a spouse, but a collaborator in the next phase of his life, which focused less on personal achievement and more on service, faith, and philanthropy. Together, they've worked on numerous charitable causes, particularly the Kickstart Kids program, which Chuck founded in 1990 to bring martial arts training to at-risk youth in Texas schools. Their daily life at the ranch reflects Chuck's evolution. Mornings begin early with prayer and exercise, routines maintained for decades. There's ranch work, time with family, charitable obligations, and the quiet satisfaction of a life that's moved beyond the need for external validation. Gina has been his anchor through health challenges, including his own serious concerns about Gina's reaction to gadolinium contrast dye used in MRI scans, which led Chuck to become an advocate for awareness about potential dangers of these medical imaging agents. What emerges from looking at Chuck's personal life is a portrait of someone who achieved extraordinary things in his public life while struggling with very ordinary challenges in his private one. The man who could defeat any opponent in a tournament ring had to learn how to be vulnerable with his loved ones, how to ask for forgiveness, how to value presence over achievement. At 85, he's reflective about these lessons, grateful for second chances, and committed to being a different kind of man in his later years than he was in his youth. The martial arts taught him discipline, but life taught him wisdom. And perhaps that's the most important belt he ever earned. 2 men, 2 philosophies, 1 shared immortality. This is the story that continues to resonate more than 50 years after Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee created their legendary fight scene in the Roman Coliseum. What they built together transcends the films themselves, becoming a foundation for how East and West understood each other through martial arts, how cinema could capture authentic combat, and how friendship could exist between competitors. Their collaboration defined an era of martial arts cinema. Before them, fight scenes were often stylized dances, theatrical, but lacking genuine martial credibility. After them, audiences demanded authenticity. Modern action cinema, from The Matrix to John Wick, owes a debt to what Bruce and Chuck pioneered: the integration of real martial arts technique into cinematic storytelling. The influence continues in ways both obvious and subtle. Mixed martial arts fighters quote Bruce Lee's philosophy about being like water, about absorbing what is useful and rejecting what isn't. The modern MMA approach of cross-training in multiple disciplines is essentially Jeet Kune Do applied to competitive fighting. Bruce's insistence that martial arts should be practical, efficient, and constantly evolving has become the dominant paradigm. Chuck's influence manifests differently, but no less significantly. Through Kickstart Kids, he's introduced hundreds of thousands of young people to martial arts training, emphasizing not just physical techniques, but character development, discipline, and respect. Students who might otherwise have never encountered martial arts have found purpose, confidence, and direction through programs Chuck established and continues to support. For Chuck, legacy isn't measured in trophies or box office numbers. Those things mattered once, perhaps, but at 85, he views legacy through the lens of impact. How many lives did you touch? How many people did you help? Did you leave things better than you found them? These are the questions that occupy him now, the metrics by which he judges his life's worth. His belief about Bruce has never wavered. Given time, Bruce Lee would have become the greatest martial artist of all time. There's no way to know if this is true, but Chuck's conviction stems from having seen Bruce's rate of evolution, his hunger to learn, his refusal to accept limitations. At 32, Bruce was still ascending, still pushing boundaries, still discovering new possibilities. What might he have achieved at 40, 50, 85? But perhaps the most profound legacy is the simplest. They were never enemies. In an industry and a culture that wanted rivalry, that thrived on conflict and competition, they refused to play assigned roles. They were mirrors, each reflecting what the other could become. Bruce taught Chuck to see beyond rigid forms, to value adaptability and personal expression. Chuck taught Bruce the value of tested techniques, of discipline maintained over decades, of power rooted in fundamentals. Together they created the greatest fight scene in cinematic history, not because they were trying to defeat each other, but because they were trying to honor each other. Every strike, every block, every movement was a conversation, a dialogue between two men who spoke the same language of dedication and mastery. The scene works because the respect is genuine, visible in every frame. One taught the world to be like water, fluid and adaptive. The other taught it to never stop moving forward, to meet every challenge with disciplined power. Different philosophies, different paths, but both leading toward the same destination: the constant pursuit of excellence, the refinement of skill, the transformation of self through dedicated practice. At 85, Chuck Norris carries his friend's memory not as a burden, but as an honor. He's the living link to Bruce Lee, the person who can still share first-hand accounts, who trained with him, laughed with him, pushed him, and was pushed in return. When Chuck speaks about Bruce, he's not speaking about a legend or a myth. He's speaking about his friend. And in an age of endless mythology and internet fiction, that ground-level truth matters. Their story reminds us that greatness doesn't require defeating others, that mastery is a journey shared with fellow travelers, and that the greatest victories are the ones where everyone emerges better than they began. Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee created something together that neither could have created alone. A friendship that refuses to die, captured in 7 minutes of cinema that will be watched and analyzed for generations to come. This is their legacy. Not who would have won, but what they built together. Not rivalry, but respect. Not competition, but collaboration. Two warriors who understood that the only opponent that truly matters is your own potential, and that the greatest gift you can give another master is to push them toward theirs.